Democratic strategist Blake Rutherford and campus reform editor-in-chief Cabot Phillips. Cabot, end with you, begin with you. You're Donald Trump. You're looking at what transpired among the Democrats. You're seeing it closely divided on the top three candidates. Are you sensing you could take this state, you could still win this race because Democrats have a problem here?
Yeah, I think you're certainly encouraged by the fact that there doesn't seem to be any real unity. There hasn't been any coalescing forming yet. We still don't even know who's going to take over that moderate lane. I think you're certainly encouraged by that. And for all Bernie Sanders' talk so far about being the candidate that's going to bring out record numbers of new voters and kind of that being his pitch of electability of if I get to the 2020 election, I'm going to bring out people that have never voted before. We haven't necessarily seen that. We didn't see it in Iowa. Certainly, we didn't see it as much in New Hampshire of people coming to the polls for the first time and coming out for Bernie Sanders. So while he certainly does have a lot of youth support, certainly has, obviously he's doing well so far, there hasn't exactly been him turning out new people, and that's what it's going to take to defeat President Trump. So I certainly think that he's encouraged. The longer this goes on, the more infighting there is, the longer before they have kind of a singular candidate to coalesce around, I think the more the Trump campaign benefits from it.
Well, you know, we remember history, Blake, and looking at, Democrats who were salivating at all the infighting and cursing back and forth among Republicans before they ultimately settled on Donald Trump, that was something that Democrats didn't see happening. I wonder if Republicans might be risking doing the same by dismissing out of hand Bernie Sanders, that if he were to get the nomination, they would squish him like a bug. That can prove wrong. What do you think?
Well, I first of all think that this is very early. I know there is a lot of energy, especially in the media, to call this horse race. The Democrats have now had contests in two small, predominantly white states with a total of 65 delegates. This is a process, and I think we've got to get through Nevada. We've got to get through South Carolina, states that are more representative. This was the point of adding these two states to this four-state pod, and I think until those states vote, we really don't have a sense. Latinos haven't had a say. African Americans haven't had a say. And then we'll see. I personally think Bernie Sanders is an incredibly problematic general election candidate. I've been very clear from that on the start. So I think, but for different reasons than Donald Trump was. So I think we just have to wait and see. I think we'll have a better sense of this race after Nevada, after South Carolina. I do think people need to chill out just a little bit, let those states vote.
No, you're right.
And then we'll see where we are.
And Elena, to his point, I mean, we're 2% into the delegate sort of quest here. I mean, there are roughly 4,000 delegates at stake here, and you need close to 2,000 of them to close the deal. And the top candidate for the time being, Pete Buttigieg, is at all of 22 delegates. So he's right there. Where is the momentum factor, you think, from New Hampshire here? That usually winnows out candidates. A few have dropped off. Deval Patrick, the latest. Andrew Yang, John Delaney, Michael Bennet, all in the last week. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, this is exactly that period in the primaries where you do start to see the field narrowing. It's not narrowing as much as some had thought it would at this point. And I think that's something that's really helping Bernie Sanders. We're seeing a lot of delegates, yes, going to people like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, but the moderate field, they're still kind of beating each other up on this on the trail right now, and that's helping fuel people like Bernie Sanders, who, whereas before he used to really have to share the more activist, leftist part of the Democratic Party with Elizabeth Warren, she's seeming to fade right now, especially after her performance in Iowa and in New Hampshire. And so it looks like they're really consolidating that support behind Bernie, whereas the moderates are still pretty split. And we had a Democratic operative speak with Axios about this today, who said, look, in 2016, the non-Trumpers, if they had consolidated early enough, President Trump might not have been the nominee. We're starting to see that same situation play out now with Bernie Sanders. And if the moderates don't consolidate, then he does have a really prominent and strong lead here.
To that point, I think the reason that Pete Buttigieg didn't win outright last night in New Hampshire is not because of Bernie Sanders, but it's probably because of Amy Klobuchar and the strong performance that she had in the last few days, especially at the debate. So we were even talking at a Buttigieg event and at a Klobuchar event, but especially at the Buttigieg event. And there were a number of people who were deciding between between the two. So for Klobuchar to get up to 20%, you never know where voters come from, but you have to assume that a few may have voted for Buttigieg had they not. And just to go back quickly to Cabot's original point about bringing in the new voters, that's something from the data I saw last night that Cabot's right, that Sanders has not been able to do, but Buttigieg was able to do to some extent, but again, was stopped short of winning outright in New Hampshire, largely because of the surge of Klobuchar.
Cabot, you're close to the Trump folks, and the argument has always been raised, the only one who could, screw it up for Donald Trump might be Donald Trump. In other words, some of this role in these, prosecutors quitting the case on the Roger Stone issue, or his firing of officials, whether right or wrong, that's the kind of stuff that would mess it up or risk messing it up for the president, not the economy, certainly not the markets. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think any day where President Trump is letting the Democrats be the main story and letting the economy do its thing, I think is a victory for him. We look at polling data out today, over 60% of Americans saying they're better off economically than they were when President Trump took office. Another over 70% of people saying they think they'll be better off a year from now than they are now. That kind of optimism is something that we haven't seen in decades, really. We haven't seen that second number since the 1970s. And so I think that obviously people vote with their pocketbooks. I think that's got to be a good sign there. And so I think President Trump letting that be the main focus is the winning point. And I think to go back to New Hampshire and kind of looking at the election moving forward, I think it's too soon to say that if one moderate candidate drops out, that we should assume that they're all going to go to the other moderate candidate. I worked on the Rubio campaign in 2016, and we kept saying once Jeb drops out, we'll get all his supporters. If Scott Walker drops out, we'll get his supporters because they're in the same lane. That obviously didn't happen. And so I think even looking last night at the data, Joe Biden, his voters said that the number 2 candidate for them is actually Bernie Sanders. That was the most common response. So wow. I think voters are a lot more fluid than we like to make them, and it's not as common for us to say, well, if they like one moderate candidate, they're automatically going to go to the other. I think there's a lot more decision-making that goes into that than just assuming they'll go one way.
And, Blake, the same could apply to Bernie Sanders voters hoping that they capture Elizabeth Warren voters, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think we have to be very careful about assuming that liberals, moderates, even moderate conservative Democrats are monolithic. I mean, there's certainly preferences depending on issues, a lot of which, at the end of the day, and as Cabot pointed out, are personal to them. So again, I want to reemphasize the point. I think we got to pump the brakes a little bit and let South Carolina and Nevada vote. I think that will tell us a lot. I do think the field will consolidate for natural reasons. Some candidates are going to run out of money. Some candidates are going to underperform. And it's going to be very difficult to make an argument to move on to Super Tuesday, where you have very expensive states like South Carolina and where you have a region, the South, where Democrats don't do well in general elections, but when you put together are a fair amount of delegates. So I think we will know a lot more in 18 days. And I think that will tell us a lot about, Bernie Sanders' standing, because, again, it is important to note that he did underperform with youth voters, and the foundation of his entire campaign is youth voters, and he couldn't get them to the polls in New Hampshire. Is he going to be able to turn that around going forward? It will also tell us a lot, of course, about Joe Biden, his standing among the African-American community, and whether South Carolina really is going to be that reset for him.
We'll see. Guys, I want to thank you. Well, Connell, I know you've already put in a travel request for